My name is Ross Wallace. I'm an advisor to the Resilient Healthcare Coalition and a principal at Santis Health. Thank you so much to all of the folks who have joined us, almost 150 people from across the country. This is absolutely amazing. We promise by the end of our time together, you will forget everything about the last couple of minutes as we've spent our time getting into this wild world of Zoom. Let me take a moment just to introduce those of you who are less familiar with the Resilient Healthcare Coalition to the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. So we are a collaborative of 16 health system partners committed to providing the leaderships, the insights, and the solutions required to make healthcare systems across Canada stronger and more resilient. The RHC encompasses a group of system leaders from industry, from the research and innovation community, and from patient groups across the nonprofit and private sectors. Our mission is to create Canadian healthcare systems that improve patient care and health outcomes by evolving to become faster, nimbler, and better able to absorb future shocks. More specifically, we're focused on accomplishing three fundamental goals: optimizing the use of healthcare data to better inform healthcare decisions, expanding and accelerating patient access to innovative health technologies, and building a world-class Canadian life sciences ecosystem that can help accelerate that access and optimize that use of data. Those are our three overarching goals, and it's not a surprise at all that this question of clinical trials would be front and center in terms of how we are eager to kind of drive this conversation forward, particularly with a federal election 3 short days away. So I'm going to take a moment just to talk about the power and the potential of clinical trials and why this conversation is so timely and so important. As all of you know, clinical trials play a key role in giving patients access to new innovations, advancing hospital research, and attracting new life sciences investments. Put simply, they lead to more innovative Canadian health systems and a stronger Canadian economy. Leaders from academia, from healthcare, industry, government, and patient groups have worked tirelessly together to create a world-leading Canadian clinical trials ecosystem. But despite the success of these efforts, the Canadian clinical trials community still finds itself facing increasingly intense competition from other leading jurisdictions around the world. And of course, we need to couple that with the need for more targeted support here at home. So the question now becomes, how can Canada combine new strategies, new partnerships, and new investments to ensure that Canadian clinical trials deliver even greater success and higher impact? And this is the absolutely pivotal question that we've invited some incredibly distinguished and thoughtful commentators to join us here today. So we're going to start in alphabetical order of the folks who you'll be hearing from, starting with Dr. PJ Devereaux. So PJ is the co-chair of the Operating Committee of Accelerating Clinical Trials, a unique partnership known as ACT. He's also a senior scientist at the Population Health Research Institute at McMaster University and Hamilton Health Sciences. Dr. Susan Marlin, who will be joining us momentarily, is the president and CEO of Clinical Trials Ontario. Kate Murray is the president and CEO of the Stem Cell Network of Canada. Veronica Prez is the senior director, study management, CVRM at AstraZeneca. And Barry Stein is the president and CEO of Colorectal Cancer Canada. So it is my great pleasure to bring together all of these fantastic folks with diverse, complementary, and important perspectives on healthcare across Canada, and on the specific question of the opportunity that clinical trials presents to the wealth and health of Canadians, and why this is such an incredibly important conversation to have. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium and the microphone over to PJ, who's going to give us a foundational level set of what he sees and ACT sees as this opportunity for clinical trials. Then we'll open it up to a brief conversation with these distinguished panelists we all have here gathered today. And from there, we will be opening the conversation in the Q&A to all of you. So at the bottom of your screens in Zoom, you will see a Q&A tab. Please take the opportunity at any point through this webinar to share your questions, your thoughts, your perspectives in that Q&A tab. We will be curating and capturing everything that you tell us, and we'll figure out a way to get as many of your questions answered as quickly as possible over the course of this conversation. So that's enough for me. Thanks to everyone for bearing with us. Thanks to all of our panelists for being a part of this conversation. PJ, I pass the microphone to you.
Thanks very much. Ross, can you hear me okay?
You're great.
Okay. First, I want to thank Santis for organizing this symposium and for the opportunity to speak to you today and tell you a little bit about Accelerating Clinical Trials Act Canada. So I hope to cover, just as a background and make sure we're all on the same page, what are randomized controlled trials, why randomized controlled trials are important, and then tell you about the Accelerated Clinical Trials Act Consortium and potentially Act 2. So why are randomized controlled trials important? Or what are they? A randomized controlled trial is a study design that randomly assigns participants to receive either the experimental intervention, which is commonly a drug, but it could be a device, and a control intervention, which is commonly a placebo. Why are randomized controlled trials important? The first thing is they are the gold standard research design to establish the effects of intervention. So this is the strongest research design that we have as scientists to actually figure out what really does work and the effects of interventions. Importantly, they're required for regulatory approval before new drugs, devices, or vaccines can be given to patients. So, as an example, if we had another pandemic, society would not be given vaccines unless we had a randomized control trial that demonstrated the benefits and the safety of that vaccine. They also provide patients with the potential opportunity for health improvements, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And they also represent a very large economic opportunity for Canada, and I'll talk more about that also. I want to highlight a case that I think so importantly identifies the potential of clinical trials, but also the challenges. So at our very first ACT consortium meeting, one of our patient representatives gave a talk, and she started off by showing a picture of her child who was 2 years of age, and you would not have to be a healthcare provider to recognize instantly that her child was very sick. And very sadly, her and her husband had been told that their child had metastatic cancer and that there was no treatment, and unfortunately, their child would not survive, and they needed to consult palliative care. The family made a decision to reject this position. They remortgaged their house. They took their child to upstate New York, enrolled their child in a randomized controlled trial. And this randomized controlled trial was not in Canada. And then the next picture she showed us was a picture of her child who is now 18 years of age. Now, obviously, the wonderful part of this story is this highlights how randomized controlled trials can actually save lives at times, even in situations where people are told there is no treatment. But it also highlights another point, which is why wasn't this clinical trial in Canada? Why did this family have to remortgage their house to take their child to upstate New York? Now, none of us would obviously knowingly design a system that will result in the premature death of a 2-year-old. But the reality is we're all complicit in the reality that we do have a system in Canada that has such inefficiencies that frequently trials just like this do not come to Canada, or a limited number of patients are assigned to Canada. And as a result, Canadians lose out on, at times, life-saving therapies. We have a moral imperative to improve the ecosystem for doing clinical trials in Canada to bring more opportunities to Canadians to participate in these trials. Hence, the Accelerated Clinical Trials Act Canada Consortium. ACT was funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research to improve the ecosystem for conducting randomized clinical trials, RCTs, in Canada. Our central guiding principle is that our activities will accelerate, optimize, and facilitate the conduct, implementation, and results translation from high-quality, high-impact RCTs to improve health in Canada and around the world. I will now tell you about a number of the initiatives that we have undertaken in ACT to try to improve this ecosystem. First thing is we want to create a greater democratization of access to participate in clinical trials to all Canadians. We have borrowed from the very successful UK portfolio system. In the UK portfolio system, the government pays to embed study personnel in all the hospitals across the country. This obviously gives many more people in the UK access to clinical trials. And it was an enormous success that led to the benefits of the recovery trial being able to happen so fast in the United Kingdom that established effective therapies for COVID that allowed us to have time to actually develop the vaccines and get them in place. This was an enormous benefit, and the world owes the UK a debt of gratitude for what happened during COVID with their clinical research, which was enormously facilitated by their portfolio system. So we borrowed from this in ACT, and we held an open competition where community hospitals across the country could apply. And we then selected 20 community hospitals where we paid to embed study personnel in these hospitals, geographically located across the country. And these study personnel are now bringing more clinical trials to these Canadian hospitals and to more Canadians. We also created the Be the Cure campaign. This borrowed from the great work that was initiated in Alberta in terms of a campaign to help educate people about the importance of clinical trials and make them aware of the options to be available to them to participate. Through ACT, we've also been very fortunate to be involved with influencing the regulatory environment. So we had the good fortune of doing a submission to Health Canada for recommendation changes to the draft of ICH E6R3. That's now been finalized. But most importantly is that we were able to contribute to the international efforts to develop the WHO guidance for clinical trials. And this is now becoming the new standard for how clinical trials will be conducted internationally. So for trials of new drugs or devices, the WHO guidance makes it clear that they will follow ICH E6 R3 revision. However, for all other trials, which is probably 90% plus of the trials, they'll now follow the guidance of good randomized clinical trials, which is much more practical and appropriate for the vast majority of trials that we've done. I was just in Geneva 2 weeks ago for the knowledge mobilization efforts related to this activity. And this is a really important advancement that will really improve the efficiency of getting clinical trials done in Canada and around the world. Through ACT, we've also been very focused on contracts. Contracts are a major bottleneck in conducting randomized controlled trials in Canada. ACT has implemented a data and samples sharing agreement in now, I think it's up to 58 Canadian centers. We're just in the process of finalizing a master clinical trial agreement for CHR-funded trials, which again will help to dramatically decrease the timelines for getting contracts signed and in place. We also had an enormous focus on creating a pan-Canadian distributive single research ethic board approval process with strict timelines for multi-center clinical trials. I want to be clear about a point. Oftentimes, the focus is only on the REB in terms of their timelines. Our strict process is that there'll be strict timelines for the REB, but equally importantly, there are strict timelines placed onto the researchers to respond to comments from the REBs. Again, we need to push for a process that makes us the most efficient country in the world for doing clinical trials. We had an open competition for groups to apply to lead this national effort. And I'm very pleased to tell you that Can Review was selected through this process. And its leadership team consisting of experts from 10 provinces and territories. And it will utilize a digital platform for ethics approval, which has already been audited and approved by both Health Canada and the FDA. You're going to hear a lot more about this from Susan Marlin in a moment, who is leading this initiative. And I just want to thank Susan and the Can Review team for taking on this enormously important initiative that will really improve the timelines for starting clinical trials in Canada. Immediate upcoming work is that we're driving for the implementation of single national distributive REB model with strict timelines, Can Review, our master clinical trial agreements for CHR-funded trials. We're initiating Indigenous trials in Canada, and our Knowledge Mobilization Award applications are out right now, and we're advocating for Act 2. We want to also grow the funding pie. So too much time in Canada has been wasted among Canadian health researchers debating how to divide the CHR funding pie. We need to learn from the European Union, which invests a lot of money into clinical trials. And they insist, though, that you must include European biotechnology companies in these trials because they not only want to improve health, they want to grow their economy. And we should never forget that the economy is an enormous predictor of health. So through ACT, we've had Canadian trialists support Canadian biotech by holding two national competitions that have been two granting competitions where we funded trials that would evaluate Canadian biotech. We also had two national meetings where we brought together over 100 Canadian biotech companies to pitch their Canadian biotech to over 300 Canadian researchers. And then we have breakout groups that allowed them to connect and work together to then submit grants for funding. We've also held additional grant competitions. We've held grant competitions for high impact clinical trials, for novel designs of trials, evaluating methods to improve the conduct of clinical trials, and the creation of new networks to be part of ACT. We're up to 34 networks in ACT of different research groups that evaluate both disease states, patient populations, and interventions. We also bring high impact international RCTs to Canada. And several of these trials have already been published in the highest impact journals, including 5 in the New England Journal of Medicine and 1 in the Lancet. When I reflect on ACT, a lot has been achieved in the first 2 years. The issue is whether or not the roots of the system change are deep enough to be sustained with only 3 years of program funding. This brings up the issue of Act 2. We are now trying to seek additional 3 years of funding to solidify the system changes that we've initiated. We want to ensure the success of the Pan-Canadian Distributive Single REB review and approval process with strict timelines. We want to sustain and expand the portfolio funding system or embed study personnel in community hospitals across Canada. And we want to ensure successful implementation of master clinical trial contracts and continue to help to grow the Canadian biotech through granting opportunities of trials evaluating Canadian biotech. New initiatives in Act 2 will also include creating a change to ensure that study personnel can inform all eligible patients about trials relevant to their health. One thing that a lot of Canadians don't know about is that most hospitals adopt a process whereby they require someone within the circle of care, that is their immediate physician or nurse, to first ask the patient if they want to hear about research. And then if the patient says yes, then study personnel can tell the patients about this. The problem with that approach is that most physicians who are even supportive of research are just busy. It's not their trial, and they don't remember to remind patients or let patients know about the trial. And as a result, most people never hear about clinical trials relevant to their own health. We need to change that process. Fortunately, some institutions like ours in Hamilton have adopted a process whereby if a physician agrees that they want to have their patients evaluated for the trial, the study personnel can then act as a steward of the healthcare provider, and they can screen all the patients and let them know about the trials. This is a big step forward. We also want to create a network process whereby investigators and pharma can go to the networks that will then distribute to 200 plus centers across the country a summary of the potential trial and let them know within a matter of days whether or not they're interested in participating. We also want to tackle issues around certain groups that have been systemically discriminated or excluded from trials, like women of childbearing potential or pregnant or lactating women, people with renal insufficiency, and create much more balanced approaches to ensure that these people are not unnecessarily excluded from many trials where, in fact, they could appropriately be included. In conclusion, RCTs provide a health opportunity for Canadians and have positive impact on our economy. ACT will achieve its goal if Canada becomes the most efficient country in the world for conducting RCTs. And again, I advocate not that we become good. We should aim to be the very best so that everyone will want to bring their clinical trials to Canada so that, as I told you about with that young child, no one misses out on opportunities like that. And if permanent efficient systems are implemented, the government implements sustained funding for RCTs, Canadian biotech grows, and more big pharma and device company trials come to Canada, then the public benefits, and ACT will be a success. Thank you very much.
BJ, thank you so much for that fantastic level set, not only about the opportunities of clinical trials for Canada, but also the sort of intensely competitive global dynamic that Canadian trials are operating within. You talked about the Canadian biotech element of this. You talked about the global pharma element of this. And, I think it's a perfect time to bring Veronica into this conversation. And so, Veronica, I'm going to start with you if I can. Obviously, Canada is in a major global competition for clinical trials investment, and AstraZeneca in Canada has done an amazing job of clearly making a business case to AstraZeneca Global that Canada is a place to do more, to invest more, to succeed more. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the lens that AstraZeneca sees Canada with and how that's been manifested in terms of what the company is doing here and the role of industry in the clinical trials ecosystem?
Sure. Thanks, Ross. So, in general, when we at a global level are considering where to allocate our clinical trials, of course, the critical factors we're looking at first are speed and quality. And the startups is so important as it, of course, enables us to maximize recruitment period, as many patients in as we can. And Health Canada here has a really quick and reliable regulatory approval timeframe for clinical trials, which definitely is on our side. We do also have several organizations that are committed to accelerating access to trials, which you're hearing from some of them today. We just heard a little bit about what ACT does now. More not the only element is what really is important overall is to deliver the whole study to plan. So I truly do believe that what sets us apart here from other quick starting countries is the fact that our fantastic investigator site and institutional partners are very highly reputable. They do have access to a diverse patient population, and the diversity is an extremely important part now that we're also looking at when we're delivering and planning our clinical trials to make sure that we are running equitable and inclusive trials and that are, of course, meeting our highest quality standards. I would say another key reason for AstraZeneca Canada for being so successful in this is really because of all of the incredible STEM talent that we have here in the country. So we really have a world-class education system here in Canada, many unique growth opportunities to offer to summer students all the way up to tenured employees alike. And our culture here at AstraZeneca Canada is very development focused, definitely an important factor in attracting and retaining experienced employees to be able to bring in more work here. So I myself started at the company around 11 years ago and have been fortunate to hold many different roles and projects across different departments and even across different countries. So we as leaders here at the company really are given the tools to enable us to develop our teams here and to grow our department here and to really continuously bring in new talent and new roles. And despite being busier than ever, I would say that our workforce is incredibly engaged in our vibrant culture here in Canada, which encourages us to even bring more and more in. So really, what I think continue doing together, we're already doing, but I would say with more demand, of course, comes increased need for experienced and available site staff. So just one thing I wanted to reflect on is I really think that's often is making sure that we do have the adequate and available to be able to actually run the trials and bring in more and more patients. So it would be really fantastic to see if we had some new robust training programs across the country, being able to expand some of the capacity at some of our existing sites or engaging new creation of new sites as well. So the more that we can do to create those opportunities will also help to target more underserved patients that are in geographical areas that currently don't aren't served with a physician that's able to bring in and provide them with a clinical trial.
Veronica, thanks for that. There's clearly a lot of different pieces that feed into sort of the business case for more trial investment in Canada, and that speed, cost, quality intersection that you called out is a really powerful one and will continue to remain sort of top of mind. So we'll definitely get some more perspectives on yours and the industry view of this as we go through this conversation. Susan Marlin has joined us, President and CEO of Clinical Trials Ontario. Susan, you are literally moving from one meeting to another, and you're in a hallway somewhere participating in this conversation. We could not be more thankful. If I can, I'm going to come to you because I know you've got a couple of pieces of this conversation that you have particularly interesting thoughts on, and I'll give you maybe a couple of options to sort of jump into this discussion. So PJ talked a little bit about the CAN review process and the importance of research ethics boards and sort of simplifying, rendering that process more integrated, more coordinated, more efficient. So you might want to talk a little bit about that. But also wearing your Clinical Trials Ontario hat, we've seen phase 2 of Ontario's life sciences strategy explicitly call out the importance of clinical trials. And clearly there's a provincial, federal, pan-Canadian element to all of this too. So I'd love your thoughts. Certainly talk about CAN Review, but would also really be interested in you sharing your thoughts on sort of the role of clinical trials and sort of fostering and spurring sort of regional life sciences strategies, and then ultimately a national life sciences strategy.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Ross. Maybe I'll do both and start with the latter.
Please.
Thank you. So, when we look across Canada in many of our provinces, they've been investing in programs to help support clinical trials probably for 10 or 15 years. And I think this has been a reflection of the fact, not that it's not important federally, but definitely provincially, there's a lot of interest in economic development. And of course, provinces hold the healthcare file. So there's also interest in there being good options for patients within their jurisdiction. So we've seen a lot of this happen over the last 10 to 15 years. When it came to Ontario, Ontario's been supporting our organization, CTO, for over 12 years now. And when the priority in Ontario pivoted to life sciences, this provided an opportunity, I think, for them to think about the clinical trial file again and not just in terms of economic development like jobs and healthcare options, but also in terms of helping to build really the SME community in Ontario. So creating a good environment here so companies could grow and ideally stay in this community. So it's been great to see that support here. We're not the only province that's named in a life science strategy. I mean, clinical trials that is named. We have great examples of that in Quebec and BC and other places as well. You know, what has changed, which we're really thrilled about in the federal environment, is, you know, essentially the funding of ACT and the federal, you know, through CIHR, the feds getting, you know, into the game of not just funding trials like project grants for trials, but helping to fund infrastructure that creates opportunities for investigators to participate in a better way. So, you know, I think, you know, being in there is a great thing, but the work we've done in the provinces, I think, is absolutely necessary that it has happened. It's helped to build a lot of the ideas, the momentum, the capacity to do these sorts of programs. And I think what we've seen across the country is different provinces coming out with programs that have developed into national things. So I'm thinking of things like the asset map, the clinical trials asset map, which shows capabilities across the country. I think that started well over a decade ago by Clinical Trials BC, or the predecessor to Clinical Trials BC, which was BC CRIN at the time. Now that's been picked up nationally and it's being supported by N2. And in between that, there were, you know, over the years, some national efforts to support that. So I think that's great. You mentioned CAN Review, and that is a newer project that we're working on, CTO, with partners across the country. And that really is another example of, because of the provincial investment, you know, we've built capacity, we've built infrastructure, we've built expertise that we're able to really leverage when we're looking at doing cross-country projects like CAN Review. So CAN Review, PJ would have already mentioned, is, you know, the opportunity to achieve a single research ethics review, and a timely one with strict timelines defined for multi-site projects across the country. This is a really unique opportunity that we have right now, both in that there's been agreement that we needed, there's been agreement about how we're going to get it done. And of course, with all the things happening around the world, or maybe just south of us, I'd say, there's also that, you know, real push to bring down provincial barriers and to do things differently. And with ethics review, there are some provincial barriers, like existing legislation in a few provinces that prevents that. So, but I come back to, we really have a moment in time and an opportunity to get this done and get it done well and right. And thank goodness, I'm so appreciative of the capacity that's been built across the country and the provinces over all these years, because it makes it so much easier to get this done.
Amazing. Susan, thanks so much for all of that. And it's wonderful to have you here, and we appreciate you fitting this in this conversation. It's great that your voices and face have joined us. So, Kate, I'm going to come to you. You have a particularly unique perspective in terms of sitting in the intersection of innovation, research, commercialization, patient care, from your particular vantage point at the Stem Cell Network. I know that you spend a lot of time looking at various kind of, you know, diverse pathways of scientific innovations working their way from sort of bench to bedside. You know, I know you have some thoughts on how we build a Canadian clinical trials community and landscape that meets the sort of diverse scientific and technological requirements of the innovations that you're looking at every day. So can you talk a little bit about how we make sure that we continue to sort of mature the Canadian clinical trial environment to meet and keep up with sort of the advancement of science and technology sort of coming down that pipeline? You're on mute, Kate.
Sorry, that's a big question. I'll do what I can, Ross.
Thank you.
So research, regenerative medicine research is, I'd say, inherently diverse. And I pick up on that word in your question, because for us, that diversity is really important to be understood as we're pushing through into clinical trials. You know, regenerative medicine encompasses everything from cell-based therapies and small molecules to gene therapy and organ and tissue repair. And so we at the Stem Cell Network, we really embrace this concept of diversity. And it's reflected not just in the science that happens across the network and all of the labs from coast to coast that we support, but also in the patient populations that are served and the treatment settings. From chronic illness to rare diseases, from hospital-based treatments, where some of these cutting-edge therapies are actually manufactured in hospital and on site. That's really important and different from a pharma type of standard where we typically see things manufactured and scaled and then deployed. In this case, when we're talking about regenerative medicine, it can be much more bespoke or personalized.
Mm.
I think right now one of the challenges that we see, Stem Cell Network, let me just go back a little bit here. We funded almost 24 different early stage clinical trials over the last 10 years or so. And they have crossed a variety of different areas and modalities, but I think one of the things that we've seen with these trials is a lot of them will not necessarily have the business case to be picked up by pharma and further deployed. And our regulatory system right now is really designed primarily with pharma in mind. It focusing on scalable commercial products, devices, drugs. But that doesn't always work for the types of products that are coming out of the stem cell network. The system, it those who are producing those are coming out of academic research hospitals, or they're in smaller biotechs where the pockets are not as deep, the expertise is not quite as available, and the time to work on all of the regulatory HTA piece, etc., is really challenging. And in fact, I think it hinders Canada's ability to grow its life sciences biotech sector. We can't take our small biotechs and scale them up to become those anchor companies if we have a regulatory system that's sort of working counter to it, not working in alignment with it. And so I think this is one of the things that we really need to start to think about in this country. And as Susan was saying, we have a moment in time right now. There's an opportunity and an interest to do things differently. And this is one of the things that I think we need to think about, because regenerative medicine is going to disrupt how healthcare is offered in the future, and we need to be ready for it. And that's really important. And we want to be able to unlock that full potential. But we're only going to be able to do that if there's a specialized regulatory pathways that are designed for these kinds of treatments, and also take into account Canadian innovations that are being produced by Canadian innovators and small biotechs. So, I propose, if we want to think about things differently, we need to develop a Canadian innovations pathway that could support from research through to procurement and deployment. So it's right across, and that system also has to have within it specialized opportunities to assess things like these bespoke therapies that are coming out of academic hospitals and small biotechs. And if we can do that, then we really are on the leading edge of being a first-in-class clinical trial system. And I think that's one of the big challenges for our country. And it's one that many countries are talking about. How do we do this right and get this right when we're using when we're doing personalized medicines, and we're developing these therapies and offering them right from the hospital. I think that this is a challenge for not just Canada, but for many around the world. So, as part of our contribution to the Stem Cell Network, we've started a new initiative around access, affordability, and adoption for cellular therapies. We call it our AAA project, and the goal with the AAA project is to try to identify where the major pain points really do exist and what can be done from a solution-oriented perspective, whether it's a policy, a regulatory, or an agreement side, what can be done to make sure that we can efficiently and effectively get these types of therapies to patients as standard of care in the years to come. So that's where we're at, because I'd hate to see all the Canadian taxpayer dollars that have been put into this brilliant field not realized by patients who are demanding and wanting to have access to these really novel treatments. And so it's good for our economy, it's good for our health, but we really need to think differently, and we really need to make adjustments to our regulatory system so it can adjust to where the puck is moving, so to speak.
Kate, it's a point so well made. I mean, if we expect to have trials that are, efficient, effective, nimble, accelerated, then arguably we need a regulatory landscape or processes that have that same nimbleness, speed, responsiveness, et cetera. So thanks for connecting that, and the piece about how you build precision medicine and clinical trials at that intersection, because of course, clinical trials require all sorts of people, but the care is delivered to a particular patient. Speaking of particular patients and their needs and perspectives in this conversation, Barry, let's come to you. So you've got, through all of your different hats, a pretty deep and broad understanding and appreciation of the role of clinical trials in both advancing standard of care across Canada and in other jurisdictions, and also contributing to the resilience of healthcare systems across Canada. So love to give you a chance to jump in on this conversation and share the sort of patient perspective on why trials matter, in what ways, and your vision for sort of their future in Canada.
Well, thanks, Ross, for the opportunity to be here today. And we've had such a rich conversation already that there's just so we could talk for another few hours, I think, on the points already that were just raised. Let me just follow up on a couple of them. I'll start with PJ. One of the first things that you talked about, PJ, was about access to trials, which should be in Canada, which may often not be in Canada. I myself participated in a clinical trial in California. And so many other Canadians have had that opportunity, but how much better would it have been to have it locally, and how much more accessibility would there be for patients to find a cure, as one that you spoke about with the brain cancer. So access is really a huge issue for patients across the country. How do we get them the information in the first place? We talked about that a little bit early on in their treatment, how they become knowledgeable about the use of clinical trials as part of their care, right? This is a sort of a new way of thinking. We talk about this a lot with Rebecca Auer, Dr. Auer at Ottawa Hospital and others. How does research really form a part of the care of our patients, and particularly I'm thinking about cancer patients across the country? If you're a patient in BC and the trial is in Toronto, not much help. Even if you can get yourself there, very often there are barriers to getting into the trial. So access is really a huge factor that can be augmented by some of the things that we're talking about. And also getting those trials in Canada, whether it's at the, as Kate mentioned, at the regulatory side, or by having, as Veronica talked about, bringing in new innovation, like having that investment made in Canada by industry. These are things that will accelerate the access to trial, but we have to be very practical about it. Getting a trial started in Canada takes a long time and a lot of money. and patients can't wait, especially cancer patients can't wait. So one of the things we mentioned, and Sue and PJ, I know talk about this often, as I do, about having a national ethics review board, one opportunity to accelerate those trials getting started. And this is a fundamental importance, and we know there are barriers to it between the provinces, many barriers, but these are things that I think are we are well placed to overcome. PJ talked about the recovery trial. That really is where we want to be, right? This is going where the puck is, or is going to be. We want to follow that. I don't want to get politics into this question. We can think about that at the same time. But politics may provide us with the opportunity today. Some of you may have seen, for example, the Liberal platform, which talks about modernization of Canada's healthcare system. This could be an opportunity. Timing is everything. The second thing is equity. While EDI may not be, or DEI may not be on the priorities south of us in the United States anymore, that certainly, again, provides another opportunity for us to give patients across the country, that opportunity who can benefit from it. But we need those new innovations and investments in data sharing and digital pathology. We have to think quite holistically about this, whether it's on molecular profiling to identify those patients that can get into the trials, the sharing of the pathology and the sharing of data, and really that collaboration between the different hospitals or trial sites, and think about it in that decentralized approach that we often talk about, but actually have not really achieved fully in Canada. And that comes back to the other matter that you were talking about, that investment that all of us have been talking about. How does that make a difference in Canada? If we can invest in these innovations, we can grow the economy. And that's certainly very, topical today. We hear all the politicians talking about the new economy and how we have to grow it. Well, this is an opportunity to get that investment, not only in life sciences, but all the way downstream, right down to the patient, right? And if more patients survive, that means more for the economy as well. Having been there in that place, having had to leave the country for clinical trials and treatment, I know that we can make a difference. Our patients are calling, and colorectal cancer patients and others, because we also run, as you know, an annual clinical trials conference that's not specific to colorectal cancer, and that brings in all the different stakeholders who discuss these new innovations and opportunities. And we also have to think about how our infrastructure can be completely redone, and Kate mentioned that as well. While we have world-class institutions, a diverse population, while we have a universal healthcare system that can provide that, we certainly have gaps. We have a fragmented infrastructure. We have slow startup times, as I mentioned, funding gaps, the access to data and interoperability across the country. We also have a lack of awareness and engagement, and that's where patients and patient groups can play a big role together with their physicians, who are very busy. But as I said, if we start to think about it as research is care and care is research, as we picked up on that slogan, then our physicians should be talking about clinical trials when the patients are diagnosed. I'll leave it with that and open it up for conversation.
Barry, that's a lot. Thank you. Research is care and care is research is a powerful bumper sticker that we all need to get on our vehicles as quickly as possible. So thanks for concisely distilling that element. We're getting lots of fantastic questions coming in the chat, lots that are quite specific, and all of which are thoughtful. So thank you for folks who've been feeding into that conversation that way. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. We're hoping, I believe every one of our panelists has kindly offered to stay to 1:15 for those who are able to join us past the top of the hour. Please do stay for a few more minutes and we'll answer a few more questions. PJ, I'm going to come back to you. You've heard a lot from all of these fine folks. We've talked about how important this conversation is and how timely it is. We are 3 days away from a federal election. Maybe I'll give you a first crack and then other folks can chime in if they'd like. What's the single most important piece of advice when it comes to clinical trials that we can give to a new Prime Minister of Canada on Tuesday? We'll let him get through the first day of his time post-election. But if it's Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, and you've got 5 minutes with the new Prime Minister, what's the most important piece of advice or recommendation or guidance that you'd want to leave that person with? And then hear other voices on that too.
There's obviously many things, but I will focus on what I think is and should be the top priority.
Please.
We published an article in the Globe and Mail just last week. In it, we laid out the case saying that we've had enormous inventions of life-saving therapies in Canada, insulin as an example, enoxaparin, there's all kinds of drugs. Yet every one of those actually are owned by foreign companies. Take as an example insulin. The rights for insulin were given to August Krok, who is in Denmark, a country of less than 6 million people. He created Novo Nordisk with that. Novo Nordisk is currently valued at over $570 billion. Last year, paid alone over $3 billion in tax revenue to a country with less than 6 million people. At times, we like to tell ourselves stories in Canada that we're not big enough to be able to compete. Well, how is Denmark doing it? And moreover, we invented that technology. The problem that I see so often is that and we're appropriately doing good investment into foundational research to develop great, drugs, great technologies, but we haven't created the environment to create the funding that people need for the phase 3 regulatory approving trials. So people basically do phase 1 or early phase 2 and sell off those interventions. So at the moment, what Canada is doing is we're subsidizing big American and European pharma. We need to change that. We need to create an investment of at least $2.5 billion in Canada that will create a revenue stream of $100 million annually, which we can then use to actually invest to fund four $20 million phase 3 trials, which we then look to triple that money both by venture capitalists and the actual pharma and the actual biotech companies. And then we could also fund 10 phase 2 trials on an annual basis. We need to do everything to keep this in Canada. Right now, by just spending money to develop basic biotechnology and have it sold off, that's not suiting Canadians in the long term. And Canadians lose out on the health opportunity and we lose out on the economic advantage of that. We need to change that.
PJ, thanks for that. I know that everybody else on this panel has advice for a new prime minister, and I will give you hopefully a chance to integrate some of that advice as we answer a few more questions if you guys are comfortable with that. So with that, let me turn to some of the questions that we've had come in from the folks who've been sort of following along closely at home, and there's a ton of questions and they're really interesting. I will try to guide them to who I think might want to take a first kick at this, but certainly, if you guys can be concise in your answers, given our time limitations and the number of questions we want to get through, we'll see if we can get more voices into this as well. So interesting question about what's happening or what we need to have happen to encourage more cross-provincial participation in clinical trials. Barry, you talked about the trial being in Vancouver, you're in Montreal or in Toronto. I mean, that can be a really challenging dynamic for a country that doesn't really have a national healthcare system. Susan, I don't know if this is a question maybe to start with you on, but thoughts on how we actually allow more effective participation in trials when the trial sort of centers maybe in some part of the country and patients maybe in another part of the country?
Yeah. So I think one of the ways that we can do this is really make the activation of trials as quick and as painless as possible. So that involves everything from the ethics reviews to the contracts to other things that happen. There was a concept that was floated years ago, and I wish I could remember his name. He worked in oncology, but he was talking. This was a decade ago about we should really have a central activation of a trial in Canada that makes it easy for a site in any province to pick it up. Because I was going to say, but when you look at moving patients from where they are to another province, there are healthcare funding issues. We've heard of patients that move and then they're ineligible for a next phase of treatment in the province that they're in because they did something somewhere else. So I think one solution is to make it so easy to activate trials that any site in Canada can pick them up quickly and just do their own little local, make sure it fits in with the resources and move forward.
Amazing. Thanks, Susan. Veronica, there's a question about training and the relationship between sort of building a next generation workforce in Canada to meet the needs of companies like AstraZeneca that are delivering trials across Canada and other sort of key players in this space. But sort of that question of how do you get the relevant experience to be seen, to be trained enough to meet the needs of companies, that sort of classic dynamic of making sure that folks are attractive enough, but also how do you get the experience if you don't have the experience to get the experience? Can you talk a little bit about the sort of clinical trials workforce and your sense of where we're going and where we need to go when it comes to building that next generation of talent?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, I can fully empathize with that. Went through it myself of how do I get the experience and try and kind of enter into the industry. So it's always something that's tough for new graduates. I think I know that there are some opportunities. Some schools offer some kind of programs, apprenticeships. I know for us, we've been looking at in our own team at what we can do to try and bring in folks that are still in university or are recently graduated. So certain like summer student programs etc. I think there's always opportunity for that. We see things like that in other countries as well in our industry. So why not be leaders in that area in Canada here? So I think really it's around trying to find opportunities like that where possible, and networking is really, really huge too. So never underestimate the power of your network because you never know when you'll be able to connect in with somebody. For me myself, I went through and started out at a smaller. I did some education, hands-on education afterwards in clinical trials, and created a bit of a network. And through that way, started out at a smaller company and started to build experience that way. There's several different ways that you can go about it, but I think that is really critical, and the power of mentorship as well. So
Mm.
for those that are newer graduates, really to try and get out there to seek somebody to ask those questions, invite someone for a coffee. I can tell you that I myself am more than happy to always do it when I have people come up to me. And I know my other peers are as well, because it's fantastic to see new eager talent that's really, really keen to learn. So, yeah.
Thanks, Veronica. Kate, there was a question to you, or sort of picking up on your comments about kind of this importance of rejigging and revitalizing kind of regulatory approval to deal with the diversity of technologies you were talking about. And the question was related to sort of whether you are seeing, as you glance outside Canada, other jurisdictions that have maybe sort of figured out pieces of this that we want to, if not sort of emulate, at least learn from, adapt, modify, Canadianize. Are there folks who you feel in your through your particular lens are doing this in different and better and important ways that we need to kind of incorporate into the way we do things here?
Yeah, I think there are. Japan is a leader in this space. Germany, Australia, all have been exploring this. Even the South Koreans are on top of this about how we do this. Where they're, one of the key things is about uh, accelerating access. This is a big issue, and so we're getting these new clinical trials up and rolling as quickly as possible and into patients, and then evaluating and addressing some of the cost and reimbursement issues. Germany's really at the leading edge for this. I think that's terrific. We need to continue to push some of the boundaries here. We're seeing in Australia, they've got a really efficient system for clinical trials and how they're able to roll out. There are lessons learned that we can use not just for regenerative medicine, but right across the board. And Japan has been a continued leader in this space, and they went back and did legislation and to make sure that you could get into patients, that you could run clinical trials effectively. So I think if you look just at Japan and at Germany and at Australia, there's a lot there that we could take and integrate into our own system. But, I just echo and underscore, if there's one thing, and one thing
Yeah.
we only do in this country, it's to harmonize that REB process.
Hmm.
One project, one review. Let's just get her done. I think that would be a huge time saver, a huge money saver. It would prevent a lot of gray hair. it would be very good. But I also just want to come back to what Veronica and you were speaking about, Ross, around training. This is an area of great importance for the stem cell network. We do a lot of clinical translation work for our trainees. We've got the mentors there. We provide extensive courses around regulatory. We provide courses on quality assurance and doing SOPs. What does it mean? We work with our partners on what GMP is all about and how to design your trials. We do this not just with the PhDs and postdocs, but we also do it with the academics as well, who need to understand what it takes to get to the translational point. And so if you're working in a regenerative medicine lab and doing stem cell research, then come and have a look and see what we offer. We offer a few different types of courses every year, and we also usually have a lot of great content that happens each fall at our Tilla meetings on this. But it's absolutely critical to our mandate to do that training, and to what Veronica was saying around mentors. Absolutely key for this, and that's something we'd be happy to help people identify if they're looking for mentors on how to do this type of work. It's so detailed and challenging and specific.
Amazing. That's all fantastic. Thank you, Kate. And Susan, you did just what I wanted you to do, which is put your virtual hand up. And I'm guessing and hoping perhaps you're going to jump in on the CAN review REB piece. And there's been a couple of questions about that. But obviously, take the mic anywhere you'd like to go. So please, to you.
Yeah, so by the way, thanks so much, Kate, for the shout out for it. We need a lot of shout outs for it, though, like many, many, many. And just one thing I'll put in a plug for, we have this concept of a CAN review partner. So these are organizations across Canada, and many, including the Stem Cell Network, are already there, and Colorectal Cancer Canada. Thank you so much. And as well as McMaster and others. It's the opportunity for organizations, whether you be patient advocacy group, whether you be a hospital, a university, a research network, whatever you are, to really, make it clear and visible that you want this to happen in Canada. So if your organization would like to become a CAN review partner, it costs nothing. What we'll do is list your name on our website so it can be seen visibly. We really do need a huge groundswell to make this happen. You can use our logo, our CAN review partner logo afterwards if you choose to on your own website, etc. But to all of you, please think about it, because it's only going to happen if we all get behind it. And again, this is a moment in time. This is a moment in time that we have to really, really demonstrate this has to happen.
Amazing. Susan, thank you. PJ, I'm going to come to you in one sec. I know you're going to have some comments to build on Susan's remarks, which is amazing. I will give you another question to think about, which is, how do we better tell the economic impact of clinical trials? And so I'll let you, if you want to take a crack at that as the second part of your remarks, but let me first let you build on Susan and Kate before you.
Yeah, so I just want to make everyone aware that ACT held numerous meetings at a national level, and we had specific meetings where all stakeholders that were relevant to it, from patient partners to REBs to institutional leadership, were involved to work through the process of how do we get to a single national REB with really strict timelines. And then I also want to highlight a point that we actually went to world leaders around the world in countries where they have single national REBs that were running them, to actually be the dominant leaders of the selection process for an open competition of groups that applied in Canada. And so I just want to highlight that after a very rigorous process of groups that really know how to run a single national REB, the CAN review group was selected. And Susan is being modest as usual. I can't say enough that this international group who selected the CAN review group were clear that this was the group that could actually bring Canada to a single national REB from groups who know how to do it. Susan is right that in May 20th, CAN review will go live. It is not true that every province or center in Canada will be part of it on day one. But we need to make sure that they all do become part of it in a very short period of time. And we need to incentivize everyone to join that. And it's really important that we do this. Again, as Canadians, We are a big country land-wise. We're not that big in terms of population. We're 0.5% of the world, the global population of the world. To make ourselves attractive to bring trials to our country, we need to have everyone inside the tent having access, and we need to be super fast. We need to aim to be the fastest startup country, and can review is one important step. So again, I encourage everyone at their site levels to get behind saying there is, given we've gone through this, we've been talking about a single REB for 30 years. We've now had an international group that had an open competition lead us to select the group that is competent to do this. We need to get behind Susan and the CAN review group to make this happen. Finally, in terms of the issue that you set up in terms of the potential economic impact,
Yeah, please.
I want to highlight again, as a clinician, my first priority is I want to advance the health for patients. But again, I do want to highlight a point. We should never forget the economy is a profound predictor of health. So even though I'm passionate about my area of perioperative vascular events, they matter, they're important. The reality is they don't matter as much as the economy. We need to have a strong economy. So we need to marry both things. We need to bring health opportunities to Canadians at the same time we build our economy. And we need to learn from Europe. The reason why America and Europe has all the big pharma companies, it's not because they have better scientists. It's because they invest more to actually develop their products all the way through. We're doing an okay job, still should do better in Canada in investing in basics to develop things, but we're not seeing it through. So people develop something and then sell it off. We need to change that. I just want to put in context Europe, and where I got the idea for within ACT for us to focus on funding Canadian biotech trials was I've been involved with a number of big funding opportunities in Europe where they give 5 to 10 times the amount of funding for an RCT compared to what you would get from CIHR, but they demand that you must include European biotech. And the reason is they want to grow their biotech. And so again, when you think about what Europe has done, Europe in Euro 2020, they were investing $12.5 billion annually into research and innovation. And that proved so successful, resulted in over 220,000 jobs. It resulted in over 4,000 IP initiations. Of the vast majority were actually patents. Was crucial for things that were very important to like even the MRA development that happened during COVID. But they got back $5 on each invested dollar as a society. You know, for what people need to realize is that if you look at the Fortune 500, annually 20 of them are big pharma, consistently within the Fortune 500. We don't have a single large anchor Canadian big pharma company. We need to change that. But we need to be willing to invest the money to do that. But we will have enormous gains if we do that. But at the moment, we're basically subsidizing big American, big European pharma companies. I'm for continuing to do our big investment into foundational research, but we have to see it all the way through. We needed a big investment to create an endowment where we'll fund big trials to get phase 3 trials done for the most promising Canadian biotech and help support them to keep them Canadian. And we need to change the tax system to incentivize our venture capitalists so they are incentivized to keep their money and invest in Canadian biotech and keep this Canadian.
PJ, that's amazing. Thank you for that call to action. Kate, I'm going to come to you briefly, and then Barry, I'm going to get you to bring the patient voice back into this question of access, trial access and trial education. So Kate, to you.
Hallelujah, PJ. Like absolutely 100% to what your call to action there. One of the things I just wanted to note was it's really important for us as a country to be de-risking so that whether it's domestic investors or foreign investors feel comfortable supporting Canadian biotechs. And so there's a couple of things that happen. So from our perspective, the Stem Cell Network, that's what we do. We de-risk so that early stage phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials can happen, so that the human efficacy data is there, so that investors feel more comfortable to come in. And they're able to put their money down. So that's really important. We need to keep on with that, and there needs to be others who are in a position to do that. We need to build on it. And in fact, for For every dollar that we've put into clinical trials, we've now had partners come in at a better than one-to-one match. So there is an interest in investing in our clinical trials. But one of the things I also just wanted to mention quite quickly is that what we hear from our biotechs and from our researchers are that investors are not comfortable with the Canadian regulatory system. They understand FDA or they understand the EMA. It's more transparent, and as a result, they rather that you run your clinical trials through the FDA or EMA rather than the Canadian system. We need to take note of that, and there has to be changes in transparency that come so that those investors feel as if it is a good bet to put their money into Canadian biotechs and to be running clinical trials here.
Okay, thanks for that build and for echoing so many important points. Barry, why don't you I'm going to give you basically the last word because again,
I've been waiting patiently, but listening to such excellent conversation.
We could go for hours, as you said, but please take a few minutes.
There are a few things that I do want to bring up. We do have quite a few pieces of the puzzle that have been invested in Canada. We had the ACT, for example, PJ is part of, and Ontario Quebec has made big investments, many of the provinces. In the training, for example, CanTrain, whereas, I'm very involved in, that's a big training program that could help to mentor as well people at all stages of clinical trials. So that's there.
Yeah.
But PJ mentioned one thing that really reminded me of some of the earlier work that when we were looking at in our clinical trials development in Canada, and that is Denmark and the public-private partnerships that they had there that rapidly expanded access to clinical trials in their country and to access to new innovations. And in Canada, we have that opportunity, I think, right now to really create that national strategy that brings it all together. And we really have to start thinking holistically. And I liked what you said, PJ, from the patient up. This is why we're doing it at the end result. We have to think about what is important to patients, look at it from a patient-centered approach, and then expand that throughout the country. But we will never get access unless the investment is made. And the public-private partnerships is one way of doing it. Yes, we need regulatory changes. We definitely need changes at the health technology assessment side as well. We've heard a lot of talk about earlier access to innovations. Well, as Veronica, I'm sure will attest to, no company is going to invest in Canada if their drug isn't going to be marketed in that country. They won't invest in the clinical trials. So we have to encourage that. So the public-private partnerships, the training, the regulatory changes, the changes at health technology assessment, even the changes in access to identifying those patients, the molecular profiling. These are all things that we have to invest in. Digital pathology, I've mentioned before, is extremely important if we're going to find patients from the more remote areas of the country to provide more equity in it. So this is an opportunity, I think, to create or streamline a national strategy where those investments have already been made and to build upon it. Patients have to be thought of first, though. How do patients get access? Where do they get access to it? How do we facilitate that access, throughout the country? And there are barriers that exist. Many of the barriers, some people think are legal, but many of the barriers are people wanting to just remain masters of their own domain. And so we have to get that collaboration spirit as part of the national strategy as well. That would make a huge difference. And I know that many of us think along the same lines. But we really have to focus, whether it's interprovincially or federally, on bringing all those little pieces of the puzzle, as I said, together.
Barry, I think those are perfect words to sort of bring this conversation, if not to a close, at least to a pause. The energy, the enthusiasm, the insights that you all brought to this discussion, I could not thank you enough. And clearly, at peak attendance, we had 175 people paying attention to this conversation. It is clearly a topic that matters to the broader innovation ecosystem across this country. There is a moment in time, as I heard all of you, I think, say, and hopefully from Monday and beyond, we can start thinking about new ways in which we engage a federal government on pushing these goals and these objectives forward. So, PJ, thank you for those foundational remarks. And to Barry, to Veronica, to Kate, to Susan, all of you for participating in different parts of this country with different perspectives, complementing each other and aligning around the need to do better and different on such an important subject at such an important time. I hope on behalf of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition, we can keep talking about these subjects. We can keep being a convener and a catalyst for these conversations. We have been recording this conversation. It will be available on the resilienthealthcare.ca website. We will also make sure that everyone who RSVP'd to attend gets a link sent to them. And we will also be following up with you about the RHC's newest and next project, which is writing an imaginary mandate letter that will be sent to the new ministers of ISED and Health Canada, laying out some of the most important areas where their collaborative efforts can make a huge difference in the next 4 years of research and innovation and access policy across Canada, including clinical trials. So many more things from us. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this. Thank you, all of our speakers, and thank you to all of the folks who extended their attendance well past 1 o'clock. You guys are the best. Have an amazing weekend. We'll see you soon.